I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to a Blacksburg museum. I'm delighted there is a Blacksburg museum. It's a dream come true for me. I've been beating my head against the wall for many years to try and get local people interested in this town's past. And tonight, with what little I have to say, at least I hope that I can convince you that this town does in fact have a great deal of history. It did in the greatest test this country has ever known, the American Civil War. The explosion of Civil War over the land in 1861 and the 4-year Holocaust that followed had a marked, if not permanent, impact on local history and society. Few people were aware how absolutely vital this traditionally neglected southwest quadrant was to the Southern Confederacy as well as to the Union. The lead mines at Austin in Wythe County produced a ton of lead a day, and that lead was transferred into bullets. Salt was then essential, not simply nice, salt was essential for the preservation of meat. And if we have northerners in here tonight and you have never eaten country ham, you have never really lived. But back then, this is a carryover from the 19th century when salt was the great preserver of meat. And Saltville produced salt rather, to the extent of about 1,000 bushels a day. And indeed, I might add that if on some Sunday or something you want to make a nice little trip, drive up to Saltville. The salt ponds are preserved. They have some of the salt-making machinery there. They're wonderful people who will show you everything. It's well worth the 2-hour drive to go up there and just see where salt comes from. Then there were the iron mines, and there were the coal mines, and above all, and this is where Blacksburg becomes affected by the Civil War, there was the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. It was the longest railroad in Virginia at the time, 206 miles from Lynchburg to Bristol. It was the only railroad that connected Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, with the West. And as a result of this, the Union forces from the beginning of the war wanted to sever that railroad, just as Lee, going north to what became a rendezvous at Gettysburg, wanted to sever the B&O at the Pennsylvania line at Harrisburg and cut the two theaters of war apart. And so the Virginia and Tennessee was extremely vital to this area, and it explains why in 1864 Union soldiers came to Blacksburg and spent the night here. And they got out quickly because they didn't have an unsynchronized stoplight system to worry about at that time. But we'll get into that. I digress. One of the things that attracts you to Blacksburg is topography. One of the things that plays a key role in the Civil War is topography. The mountain ranges, the isolated valleys, the narrow roads, all of these things combine to make large-scale military operations impossible. So what you see happening throughout the war are what we call Union probes. A Union force, mostly mounted, would leave Charleston, and it would come dashing eastward. Its major aim always to cut the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. But when it can cut the line, then it's going to spread out and go to the other communities around to do what in military parlance is called forage. You know the word is steal. And so they will do extensive foraging in this area as they did here in Blacksburg. Remember that back then this was mining and farming country. Remember too that in such an environment slavery was integral. The 1860 Montgomery County census contained 8,200 names. 2,200 of those names were slaves. This county was 1/4 slave. And you don't expect that when you start thinking about Civil War history. Now, on the eve of Civil War, Blacksburg was less than 70 years old. It was a tiny village. It had developed and it had grown almost solely as a rest stop for the wagon trains. What little I know about Blacksburg history came from two people. One was Nelson Price. Many of you, the old residents here, will remember Nelson. He taught engineering at Tech and retired. His home was donated to the town when he died. Nelson was a walking encyclopedia of local history. And he and I tramped through woods and up mountainsides and whatnot. And we weren't carrying on a conversation. I was listening and he was talking. And it was just wonderful to be in his company as long as we were. And the second man who taught me so much about local history was J. Ambler Johnston, Mr. Virginia Tech. as he was affectionately known. He was an architect who designed and built most of the Tech campus. Uncle Ambler was from Salem. His father was a member of the Salem Flying Artillery in the Civil War, but he was a great student of local history, and he always looked at local history through the eyes of an architect. And one of the first things I learned from him was a simple premise about this area. First there were the buffalo, and then there were the Indians, and then there were the white men. And what he was telling me was that back in the beginning of time, when creatures first walked the earth, it was the buffalo who, by animal instinct, developed the paths and trails that were easiest for them to traverse in moving from one spot to another, especially climbing as they go southward. And then the Indians may not have been Harvard graduates, but they had sense enough to know that what was good for the buffalo was good for them. And they followed the buffalo's instinct, and they simply converted the buffalo trails into Indian paths. And as the white settlers started west, they too played copycat, and they followed the Indian trail. So it was the buffalo who first established the trails and the paths that would lead through these great mountains. You don't see this today because we educated people have just bastardized everything. If you want to take an amazing trip sometime, let me suggest you go to Roanoke 3 times and drive to Blacksburg. The first time you come up Old 11 and 460, up through Shawsville. You will climb one mountain, and that's Christiansburg Mountain. When you come through Shawsville, you will go up one mountain. However, if you followed the original Buffalo Indian Trail, you would have started at Catawba, and you would have come up the valley, and the only mountain you climb is the hill that becomes Harding Avenue as you climb up from the cheese factory to come up here. That's the only high ground you see. The Indians obviously knew more than the federal government when it came to building highways. Now, the third path to come up is the one you travel. Now, that is one of nature's wonders for the kickbacks that obviously were involved in the construction of I-81. Think about I-81. The first chain of mountains you're going to come to is Oronto. And you're going to climb up to the clouds and go down in the bottom. Then you're going to come across the railroad down in the bottom, and lo, you're going to climb another mountain. They could not have purposely found a more difficult way to get to Blacksburg than the builders of I-81 did in coming up here, especially when you take I-81 and compare it to that nice leisurely Sunday afternoon drive up the Catawba Valley and to the foot of the hill. And the wagon trains coming west, wagon trains that carried Davy Crockett, Boone, Clay, others, would all stop at the bottom of the hill where the cheese factory is, Luster's Gate, many of you know. And then one whole day would be spent climbing that mountain that makes its way up to the top of this hill. Once they got to the top of the hill, the animals were worn out. And so here on the crest of this plateau, the wagon train stopped to rest. And that's where Blacksburg began. It was a wagon train stop. And if you want to get a good view of this, and now's the season to do it, you've got about a couple of more weeks before the blooms come out, drive up to the town golf course and drive in the parking lot and look north. On a cold, clear winter day, you can see past Roanoke. That extension of the Shenandoah Valley is just as clear as a bell. And then you get back in your car and you say, ooh and ah. And then you start down from the golf course, and what do you see? If you look straight ahead coming down from the golf course, there's the extension continuing. And you see the great gap in the mountains, just as clear as can be. So here, the settlers stopped, and here, Blacksburg began, a kind of White's truck stop, if you will, for the wagon trains of that time. Now, wagon train stops don't grow very much. They grow very slowly. And by 1860, Blacksburg was still a small town. The 1860 census showed it had 406 inhabitants, 68 households, which average about 6 people to the household. We didn't have television and other distractions back in those days. Now, these 406 residents included 52 slaves and 3 free blacks who lived here in Blacksburg. The families who were the backbone of the town were names with which you're all familiar. These are the people who had made Blacksburg by 1860, the Prestons, the Blacks, the Kents, the Kipps. And then there were other families, most of whose names are now immortalized by street names. The Draper, Kane, McDonald, Hardwick, Wall, and Grissom. Blacksburg then was a marketplace and a service center. The occupation of the male citizens would tell you that this was basically a trading shop as the wagon trains went through. In 1860, there were 14 shoemakers, 9 farmers, 5 blacksmiths, 4 wagon makers, cabinet makers, saddlers, carpenters, plasterers, a brick mason, 4 teachers, 3 physicians, and 2 ministers. The Methodist and the Presbyterian churches were the dominant face here. The Baptists hadn't yet caught on, but they would catch up as Baptists quickly do once they planted a seed. The town was also, incredibly enough, an educational center, literally in the western wilderness, for in 1854, a Methodist seminary named Olin and Preston Institute had been established here. And basically it was on the little hill where the town's Christmas tree stands as you come into downtown Blacksburg. Now, as the secession crisis of 1860 and 61 worsened, Blacksburg became increasingly Confederate. It really had very little choice. It's part of Virginia, and Virginia itself became increasingly Confederate. Indeed, Montgomery County's representative to the Virginia Secession Convention was no less than William Ballard Preston. And it was William Ballard Preston who, on April 16, 1861, introduced the Ordinance of Secession that passed the convention the next day and took Virginia out of the Union. A Montgomery County political leader was the leading force. Now, that state departure brought an amazing enthusiasm and response from the people of Virginia in general and Montgomery County in particular. I said there were about 2,200 people in this county. Well, you can figure there probably were about 400 men of military age in that 2,200 population. 100 of them will answer the first call to duty. 1/4 of the eligible males will be gone by May of 1861. And they go into all different units, but they're not so many units when you look at them in a compact way. 5 different infantry companies ultimately contained Montgomery County soldiers. An infantry company is 100 men. The Preston Guards were part of the 24th Virginia, and the Montgomery Guards became part of the 54th Virginia. I just finished editing a collection of letters by Theophilus Rainey, who was in the Montgomery Guards of the 54th, and they are printed in this current issue of the Smithfield Review, and I want to thank Hugh Campbell and others for accepting those letters. Then there were 2 of the companies. Yet the deepest pride of all in this region should center and did center then on the 4th Virginia Infantry Regiment. Of 11 companies in that regiment, 1/3 came from Montgomery County. Company B was the Fort Lewis Volunteers. Company E was the Montgomery Highlanders. Company G, the Montgomery Fencibles. And Company L, an unnamed company, was comprised for the most part of Blacksburg men. The 4th Virginia left for war under the command of the county's highest-ranking officer, Colonel James Francis Preston. Born near Blacksburg in 1818, Preston had attended West Point for 2.5 years before resigning owing to bad health. In the Mexican War, he served as a captain of a company that had been raised here in Montgomery County. Preston then took command of the 4th Virginia, 10 companies, 1,000 men in 1861, and he took command only 2 weeks before the regiment fought its initial battle at First Manassas, or First Bull Run as Northerners call it. And in that first action, Preston was seriously wounded. He never recovered from his injuries. He died at Smithfield Plantation in January 1862, about 7 months after the battle, and he's buried in the Smithfield Cemetery. James Howell was among the first to enlist in the Montgomery Highlanders, which was primarily a Blacksburg company. On the unit's departure for war, Howell wrote, "The people of Blacksburg gathered on the streets in excited groups, taking leave of their loved ones. Most of the young ones were shouting and laughing, and some of the older ones were crying. But the boys were happy and gay with the prospect of going out in the world on their first great adventure." Not one of those men had any conception then, in the spring of '61, of what that adventure would really entail. The 4th Virginia ultimately became part of the now famous Stonewall Brigade. Under legendary General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, the 4th and its 4 sister regiments achieved everlasting glory and stunning losses in the course of the Civil War. About 1,500 men would serve in the 4th Virginia. When surrender came at Appomattox, 46 men were left for duty. 11 of those men were in 3 companies from Montgomery County. This county had sent probably somewhere close to 700 or 800 men into the war, and 11 of them walked back home. As I discovered when I published a history of the regiment, there is not a graveyard of any size in this county that does not contain the remains of at least one Johnny Reb. Company E of the 4th Virginia was the Montgomery Highlanders. It was, as I said, primarily the 1st Blacksburg unit. His first captain was Charles A. Ronald, R-O-N-A-L-D, and I've always been amazed at why nothing is named for him, but he's a very enigmatic figure. Born in 1827 in Montgomery County, Ronald studied law and became a well-known Blacksburg attorney. In the Mexican War, he served in Captain Preston's infantry company. Ronald led his Civil War company until April 1862, when he became colonel of the 4th Virginia. At the August 1862 Battle of Cedar Mountain, Ronald seems to have gone completely to pieces. He was temporarily in command of the Stonewall Brigade, and yet his questionable conduct in action and his totally incoherent battle report after the action created some strong questions about the man's fitness for command. In October 1863, Colonel Ronald was wounded in the thigh by an artillery shell. Lingering effects of the injury forced him to resign from the Army. He came back to Blacksburg and resumed his practice of law. He died in Roanoke in 1898. He's buried today in Westview Cemetery. If you look hard enough, you will find his stone. It has the most mysterious inscription of any tombstone in Westview. On the tombstone is simply the words, "I have suffered." And why, we have no idea. Whether it was in the war, after the war, whether he had a tough wife or a tough life, we don't know. If the town of Blacksburg wants to focus its pride on any one unit in the Civil War, it should be Company L of the 4th Virginia. The company came almost entirely from this little village of 400 people. You look at the muster rolls, it's like reading the family tree for the Price family. I mean, there were Prices by the dozens in Company L. The company's first captain was Robert G. Newley. In the April 1862 Army elections, Newley failed to gain re-election, and his successor was Captain Jonathan Evans of Blacksburg. Evans served gallantly until November 1863, when he was killed in action in the Battle at Payne's Farm, Virginia, down near Culpeper. He's buried in a solitary grave alongside Glade Road here in town. A total of 133 men served in Company L of the 4th Virginia. How did they fare? Of the 133 Blacksburg area soldiers, 12 were killed in action, 23 died of illness, 30 were prisoners of war, 31 were wounded in action, and 22 were discharged for wounds or chronic sickness. In short, of 133 men in that company, there were 118 casualties. And people say that Blacksburg has no Civil War history worth remembering. Company L of the 4th Virginia would tell you differently. How many of you know anything about the Battle of Blacksburg? I didn't think so. There was one, you know. There was one. On May 9th, 1864, a large Union contingent bent on destroying the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad between Dublin and Central Depot, as Radford was then called, encountered a makeshift Confederate force a few miles north of Dublin, and there occurred the Battle of Floyds Mountain, the largest battle ever fought in southwestern Virginia. Following the engagement, element of the Federal Army fanned out to clear out any opposition that might exist in the New River Valley. And one such unit sent over in this direction to reconnoiter was the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves, an infantry regiment under the command of one Captain Robert Johnson. Before daylight on Wednesday, May the 11th, 1864, with rain falling heavily, the Pennsylvanians crossed the New River at Pepper's Ferry, which is the Route 114 crossing. The column trudged up from the river and continued in the rain along Price's Fork Road toward Blacksburg. A small Union detachment swung over and ransacked Whitethorn Plantation, the country estate of the Kent family. Other farms en route were looted, including the Kipps property, only 2 miles outside town. Rain continued falling. The mud grew deeper, and the Union advance slowed to a crawl. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the lead elements of the 3rd Pennsylvania entered Blacksburg. At that moment, the first casualty on this movement occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Linkus was home on furlough from the 36th Virginia. The arrival of the Federals caught Linkus by surprise. The colonel mounted his horse and tried to escape, yet his horse was shot from under him. Linkus himself was wounded in the hand and taken prisoner. He was the first casualty of the Blacksburg campaign. Captain Johnson established the main camp for the 3rd Pennsylvania in and around the brick building that was the Olin and Preston Institute. The soldiers were basically camped out along what is now College and Main Streets. Blue-clad troops fanned out in every direction in search of food, clothing, and shelter from the downpour. A small detachment of cavalry were with the 3rd Pennsylvania, and they were sent out as to kind of be an outguard, if you will, a picket line. And all that we knew, the only thing I found, and Nelson Price had never found this, I tracked it down, the cavalry pickets set up their command post on, quote, a dominating wooded ridge overlooking the town proper. And Nelson Price and I must have spent a week going around town trying to find that dominating wooded ridge. And it's kind of hard to do unless you've got a historian's eye, because when a historian looks at something, he doesn't see the houses, the neon signs and whatnot. You see the lay of the land. And we finally concluded, and I still think it holds up, that that dominating wooded ridge was right across the street where the middle school is. And that's where the cavalry set up their command post. Late that afternoon, on May 11th, the great battle exploded. A small band of either Confederate guerrillas or Southwestern rednecks, one or the other, appeared out of nowhere and captured 2 Union pickets. Federal cavalry immediately gave pursuit and overtook the Confederates on Roanoke Street. A brief running fight ensued. See, Roanoke Street's always been active in this town. A brief fight ensued on Roanoke Street. The 2 captured Federals were rescued, 2 Confederates were killed, and 9 of their horses were seized. And that was the Battle of Blacksburg. And it's still raining when it's all over with. Rain continued throughout the night, and at 4:30 a.m. on May 12th, Johnson led his Pennsylvanians out of Blacksburg, not out of North Main Street. North Main Street didn't exist. The Federals tramped west on Giles Road, crossed Brush Mountain, passed through Newport, and disappeared. Somewhere near the Kanawha River, the scattered Federal units came back together, and the great campaign that had basically culminated at Floyds Mountain with kind of anticlimaxes taking place at Christiansburg, Blacksburg, and elsewhere was over. The war also touched this area in another way, as Dorothy Bodell has pointed out in a great book, little book she's done. 4 miles east of Blacksburg was a popular spa known as Montgomery Yellow Sulphur Springs. It had been in Yellowstone White Sulphur? Okay. It had been in existence for a number of years. And in 1862, it was converted into a military hospital. It had a capacity for 400 patients. At times, the soldier population was well above capacity. Late in 1862, a smallpox epidemic struck, but it was fortunately brought under control by tight quarantine. Smallpox vaccination was very crude and primitive at that time. If a smallpox epidemic broke out, you generally had to let it run its course with devastating effects. A novel feature of the Sulphur Hospital were the nurses. Most of them were Catholic nuns. Few of the soldiers were suffering from battle wounds. No battle had occurred around here in 62 or 63. Most of them were suffering from sickness and disease, which will kill 2 men for every 1 man who was killed in battle. And if I had to guess what the problems were, I would say the overwhelming number of maladies were diarrhea and typhoid fever. Given the diet they ate and the diet they didn't get, diarrhea was inevitable, given the fact that they just drank any water that looked good, making sure there was nothing crawling in it when they drank it. Typhoid fever was inevitable as well. While what is left of the hospital record shows that 147 men died at the Springs, the nearby Soldier Cemetery came to have about 265 graves by war's end, so there was some shoddy bookkeeping, or else they were doing a lot of burying out there in the dark of night. The Springs reopened for normal business in 1867. There, the Southern Historical Society was formed in the immediate post-war years, and the Springs would stay in operation until their closing in 1923. This community's chief reservoir for history is Westview Cemetery. It's sad to say that, but if you go to Westview, there's a lot of history out there. I found a lot of history in cemeteries. I love to walk and look at tombstones. I worked my way through graduate school in the funeral business in Atlanta. I worked for the second largest funeral home in Atlanta. And a lot of you are smiling. Can you think of a quieter place to study and write than a funeral home? But when we would have funerals, say out in the country where you've got a couple of loquacious ministers handling the service, you know you're going to be there a good while. So I'd always walk through the cemetery and look at tombstones. You just run across some incredible epitaphs there. The most astounding one I ever ran across, and I'm probably going to get this confused, was a stone that had a 4-line stanza on it that said, "Stranger pause as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you will be. So prepare in death to follow me." Well, I mean, that was awesome. But somebody with a sense of humor had written a little couplet down at the bottom with lipstick. And the couplet said, "To follow you, I'm not content unless I know which way you went." But go out to Westview sometime. You see the history of Blacksburg in that cemetery. There are many links with the past. Among them is the inconspicuous grave of one Thomas Nelson Conrad. He's truly a unique figure in all of American history. In 1861, Conrad was a young Methodist minister, and he had a church in Whitfield. He entered the Southern Army as chaplain of the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, and he served faithfully in the cavalry for 3 years. Then in 1864, for reasons we can't figure out or how this happened, Conrad transferred to the espionage service, and he became a Secret Service agent for the remainder of the war. And he became one of the South's leading spies in the last year of the war. If you read his memoirs, there's been no one that's ever equaled him in the field of espionage. Why is he buried in Westview Cemetery? Because Thomas Nelson Conrad was the 3rd president of Virginia Tech. One Blacksburg citizen merits special mention in any discussion of this town's Civil War history, and that was Harvey Black. He was the grandson of one of the family founders of this town. Harvey Black was one of 3 physicians practicing medicine in the town when Civil War came. He quickly joined the Confederate Army. You can almost guess what's going to happen. He was appointed surgeon of what regiment? The 4th Virginia. And the zenith of his wartime service came in the early morning hours of May 3rd, 1863, when the 35-year-old Black was one of 4 surgeons who performed the amputation of General Stonewall Jackson's left arm. In the post-war years, we remember 2 things about Dr. Harvey Black. Both occurred in 1872. In that year, he was elected president of the State Medical Society, and I think he was the first physician west of the Blue Ridge Mountains to be so honored. And he was highly instrumental in 1872 in securing for Blacksburg a land-grant college that is now the state's largest university. Black died in 1888, apparently of prostatic cancer, and he too is buried in Westview Cemetery. Now, it's commendable, of course, to work for the present and to plan for the future. Yet to ignore the past is to abandon one's culture and dismiss one's heritage. Scores of generations and thousands of individuals have brought Blacksburg to the point where it now is. We must never forget them. What we have, we owe to them. Preserving their accomplishments as much as possible is a simple and decent way of acknowledging that the benefits you and I have here are not a creation as much as they are an inheritance. And we are a bridge to make sure that that inheritance which we have been given is passed along to generations yet to come. And so as the first lecturer of this series, I heartily congratulate the Blacksburg Museum and its officers, and I wish it Godspeed and good luck in all of its endeavors. Thank you. Thank you. Now, to be perfectly candid with you, as I am all the time, I told you everything I know about Blacksburg. I'll take questions, but I've told you everything I know. So if you've got questions, feel free to ask them. If you want to kind of skid away out of Blacksburg, that's fine. Yes, Francis?
This is out of Blacksburg, but is there any truth to the story that when the Confederates were leaving Blacksburg and trying to get away from the Union Army, that they took a load of gold and dumped it in the lake, the mountain lake?
You believe that? I don't think that's true. I think that's a spinoff of Minnie Ball Hill. Now, Minnie Ball Hill has some truth to it. when General David Hunter and his Federals were blown out of Lynchburg, and they start fleeing west, you know, and General John McCausland catches a tail end of them at Hanging Rock, and they fight a brief but very spirited fight. And Hunter heads over the mountains, trying to get back to the Kanawha Valley and to Charleston. And by the time they reached the top of the mountain, they were exhausted, the animals were exhausted, and they had to get rid of surplus stuff, and Hunter had no intentions of fighting again. So as legend goes, he dumped all the ammunition up there near Mountain Lake. And it became known as Mini Ball Hill. I know some people who have found a mini ball there and a mini ball somewhere else, but no one has ever found a big cache of mini balls, and I don't think the story of the gold thing has much validity to it. For one thing, nobody had much gold at that time. And if you did, you hoarded it because Confederate currency was so worthless. You know, by 1864, the Southern Confederacy stopped manufacturing dollar bills. The paper and the ink cost more than the dollar was worth. Inflation was just galloping out of control. So gold was the big denominator at that time. And I can't imagine there would be much gold out this way. The railroads might have demanded gold payment, but I can't think of anyone else who would have. Anyone else?
Excuse me. When I was a kid, my parents got the TimeLife Civil War series, and there was a reference in one of the books to apparently, I'm wording this wrong, a group of Confederate deserters set up some kind of sort of kingdom to fight them in Floyd County. But I never heard anything else about that experience.
I don't know anything about it either. And I'm not going to comment on the TimeLife series. I have a volume in that series, and I regret to say. This area had a rough time during the Civil War. Christiansburg, for reasons unclear to me, became a great hotbed for Unionist underground activities. There was a group called the Heroes of America, and they had their headquarters in Christiansburg. And basically what they were trying to do is undermine the Confederacy as much as they could. And so the Confederate Army continually had to dispatch troops out this way, not only to guard the railroad, but to guard the other valuable resources of this earth, the coal mines, the lead mines, the salt works, and things such as this. Deserters would flock to this area, and this became a great haven for deserters, and mainly most of them would get here by train if they could to Christiansburg, and then they would head into Floyd County, and they could hide over there real easy. And they hid over there real easy. And Floyd County became just a great haven for deserters on both sides. But there was a great deal of lawlessness in southwestern Virginia. And those of you who've seen that wonderful movie Shenandoah with Jimmy Stewart, remember how the renegades come and tear up Charlie Anderson's farm and do some murdering and whatnot. That kind of thing was taking place here. Because it just stands to reason to me, as kind of an educated deduction, that if about 1/4 of the population goes into the Army, and the hardy males are in the armies, there's absolutely no defense, there's no protection back here. And the civilians were just at the mercy of roaming bands of I wouldn't even dignify by calling them guerrillas, just desperados, banditos, or whatever you wish to use, who would prey on the innocent and the weak, and they did. There's a lot of corroboration that civilians suffered badly out here. And you've got to remember, this place was remote, extremely remote from civilization. And there are people east of Lynchburg and Charlottesville and Danville in that line who still think it's remote. Then there's Virginia, and then there's what's left out this way. And I come from that borderline, Danville, where half the population said, "You going to black what?" And they just don't know the West, not in any particular reason to want to know it. But for southwestern Virginia, the Confederacy would not have lasted anywhere as long as it did, because it's the natural resources out here, the lead, the iron, the coal, the salt works, plus that railroad. And you can never belittle the railroad. That railroad was really an umbilical cord for the Southern Confederacy, the only line that linked Richmond with the West. And amazingly, they kept it open throughout most of the war. When the Battle of Floyds Mountain was over, the Federal Army quickly moved on Dublin, and they tore up, I think it's 12 miles of track from Dublin to the river, and they burned the bridge. And as you drive on, if you take the back road to get over to I-81, you'll drive on Route 11, you go right beside the B&T. The track bed is the same. And all of that 12 miles was torn up, and the bridge was burned. The line was back, they rebuilt the line in about 5 days to the river. And then the trains would come up to the river, and then they would ferry people across on a boat and put them on another train on the other side of the river, and the trip would continue, and they rebuilt the bridge. We did a Blue Ridge documentary on that on the railroad in southwestern Virginia, and we went down, I remember one cold January day, and there's some stone pilings over in Radford, and we all thought they were the pilings of the old wooden bridge, and I remember how cold it was, and you use a favorite trick in movie making so that you don't blow smoke in the wintertime. You suck on ice before they put the camera on you. So here it was about 10 degrees, and I'm like an idiot standing out there on the riverbank sucking ice. And then they cut the cameras on, and then I made this beautiful spiel about this is all that remains of a once great trestle that had felt the heavy hand of war and all this kind of thing. And then about a week later, we found out that they weren't the pilings at all. They came later on in the post-Civil War years. And what's so much fun around Blacksburg is that it's all there, and you've got to dig for it. And everything I've told you tonight has taken about 30 years to dig, just to find these little things. But I think somewhere along the line, certainly I think the town or the museum would want to consider the possibility of putting up sidewalk markers at this spot occurred such and such and such, and just point out the Civil War awareness of Blacksburg. As I often tell people, and I will next week lecturing on the Mississippi Queen, Virginia suffered as no other state has ever suffered in war during those 4 years. 60% of the Civil War was fought in this state. 60%, 3 of every 5 battles took place in this state. Virginia suffered more destruction in 4 years than any other community in the Western Hemisphere ever has, even in the unvolatile Central and South American nations. No area has ever suffered the devastation that Virginia suffered. And between 1861 and 1865, there wasn't a city of note that wasn't destroyed in some form or fashion by that war. And we have risen wonderfully from the ashes. We're dead stop now with the Virginia General Assembly, but we have risen wonderfully from the ashes. And I think we need to pat ourselves on the back about how far we have come as Virginians since then. And I think historical markers and historical museums, historical archives are just absolutely necessary. It's just an old adage in history. You learn this in grammar school. How in the heck can you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been? I mean, that's just a simple premise of life. We have to know our past. We can't ignore it. We can't change it. We made mistakes in the past. The value of history is to ensure you don't make those mistakes again. And so we study things like the Civil War. You point to that. That's not all the things that were wrong with the country back then and what people were trying to make right about it. And that is history in the making. And that's what makes history so valuable. And there are people who obviously are F students in history who persist in writing letters to newspaper editors saying slavery didn't have anything to do with the Civil War. Now that's an F student in history. I mean a flat F. It's like a football player once came to see me and I'd had to fail him. He said, Dr. Robertson, I don't believe I deserved an F in this course. I said, I don't either, but that's as low as the scale goes. Slavery has everything to do with the Civil War. And if you simply look at the National Congress from 1846 to 1861, 15 years, all the National Congress argued about was slavery. Every year brings a crisis. That crisis is over slavery. And you start this thing, well, state rights had something to do with it. State rights didn't have anything to do with it. State rights was a Southern escape that Southerners used when the heat got hot in the 1850s. Then they began to say the states have all this sovereignty, which the states didn't have then and they don't have now. And so you have to admit that slavery was wrong. You can't write it off. It was there. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. That is fact. Now, had they had a little reason to think about it, had they had 20th century perspectives, they might have changed their minds. I doubt it, given the economic situations of that time. But the fact remains there were slaveholders, and you have to concede that they were slaveholders. They had their own viewpoints of life. And this is why you have to study history. What gave them those viewpoints? Why did they think as they did? Why would they fight as they did? Once you get the answers, then you have an idea that by God's help it never happens again. And it could happen again. A democracy is the most blessed form of government that God ever gave to man. It's the most dangerous. Because in a democracy, as I'm sure the mayor and town council have learned recently, everybody gets to talk. And the results can be devastating sometimes. Everything can break loose. Only one thing holds a democracy together: the ability to compromise. That's it. Nothing else. The ability to compromise. And when democracy loses that one thing, democracy falls apart. And there is historical precedent for it, the American Civil War, where Northerners and Southerners argued and argued and argued, and speaking soon turned to shouting, and it's just a small step from shouting to shooting. It's there. History shows it. And this is what we have to remember and ensure that we don't bring it down to something like that again. But local history is the seed from which a nation's annals spring. History begins locally, and we need to work on that here. I think out in southwestern Virginia, we all need to work on it. I've just edited the letters of a wonderful young man from Marion, Virginia, John Preston Sheffey. Yes, you heard his middle name, Preston. His mother was a Preston from Smithfield. He was raised in the aristocratic element of Marion. His father was a lawyer, Smith County's representative to the secession convention, and Press Sheffey went into the Army as a captain in the 8th Virginia Cavalry. And the letters that he wrote to his intended, whom he finally married in 1863 by bluffing her into a marriage. That's a wonderful love story. And he was stationed not with Lee. All of his activities were along the Virginia-West Virginia border. He describes the Battle of Narrows, the Battle of Giles Courthouse, engagements that you only see a passing reference to here or there. He goes into them in detail. It's a wonderful chronicle of letters of southwestern Virginia in the Civil War. And these letters are being published by Louisiana State University Press. The book's coming out in late October, and the people of Marion with a sense of history are going to have a John Preston Sheffey Day, you know, with all the hoopla and whatnot, and the book will debut in Marion with a big resounding historical thing. And John Clark, maybe the mayor knows him, the city manager down there at Marion, he's already started cleaning up the cemetery. See, we've already got progress. They're cleaning up the local cemetery down there to get ready for John Preston Sheffey Day. Now that's fun history. That's using history to great satisfaction. And I think Blacksburg can do the same thing. There's never been a day to Harvey Black. And the existence of Virginia Tech is due as much to him as to any one individual that we know. It would be nice sometime to have a day in memory of Harvey Black. Maybe go up and put a flower on his grave. It would be something that grave has not felt for 100 years. And he might appreciate that. It's just a lot we can do. But just to sit back and say, well, I don't know, so-and-so used to know something about that, maybe he can help. One easy thing you can do is what we call living history. Put these tape recorders underneath the elderly folk here in Blacksburg and get their reminiscences forever on tape. We did that with Uncle Lambda Johnston. We were working now, and Paul Lancaster was of immeasurable help to us. We went down and taped Dr. Alexander McCausland. Any of you heard of Dr. Mack? He is the grandson of Confederate General John McCausland, who raised him. Dr. McCausland is a physician. He's in his mid-90s. He still practices medicine down in Roanoke. And he's got a mind clearer than mine. And we put the microphone on him, and he told us so many wonderful things about his grandfather and the Civil War and VMI back in the old days. We need to do that with our seniors in this town while they still know things. One of my biggest regrets in the 3 decades I've lived here is that I never wired Nelson Price. I should have put the tape on him. And as we were riding all around with that wonderful dog Pete he had, the three of us riding all over this county, seeing nooks and crannies nobody really ever does see, and learning a lot of history together. I should have had him on tape, and I didn't. And it's truly one of my big regrets. So there's just a lot of little fundamental things that you can do. And I think you can find a lot of people in town who feel the same way, and we can all work together and I think come up with something to preserve the past as we look forward to the future. And you can't live a life any better than that. Thank you so much.